Lost in the Barrens, Chapter 12, River of the Frozen Lake, page 93. At dawn, the boys scrambled out of their deerskin robes. A light breeze rolled in over the plains from the down northwest, carrying with it the faint barnyard smell. Jamie sniffed the air curiously, wondering where the smell came from. He climbed a hill near camp and looked across the river. There were the great herds at last. They were moving south in a never-ending stream in long, twisting lines, each deer following the one ahead. 30 or 40 of these strings, some of them 2 miles long, were in sight at each time. They looked like giant brown snakes crossing a vast meadow. From the river's edge, where he was getting water, Owasin called to his friend. "Come here," he shouted. "I have something to show you." Jamie joined him, and Owasin pointed to the shoreline at his feet. Along it was a foot-wide band of whitish material that looked like felt mat. It stretched out of sight up and down the river on both shores. Jamie picked up a handful of the queer-looking stuff. "Why, this is deer hair," he exclaimed. Owasin grinned. "Do you think you could make a mattress of it?" he asked. "The old-time Chippewas used to." "Where did it all come from?" Jamie wanted to know. "From the deer. Right now, they are shedding their summer coats, and the hair is loose. Somewhere upstream from us, the herds are crossing the river, and they shed so much loose hair that it makes this mat along the riverbank for miles and miles." Jamie tried to imagine the number of deer that must be involved, but he found it beyond his power to estimate. That was not surprising. Down the valley of the river of the frozen lake, more than 250,000 caribou were moving in the autumn flood toward the forests. "Anyway, it proves we must be on the right river," Jamie said at last. "There couldn't be more than one valley carrying so many deer. Shall we walk along the shore and see if we can find any signs of Denicazi?" Taking only a small pack of meat, the boys set out upstream. For an hour, they walked leisurely, while on opposite side of the river, the endless flow of deer continued. Jamie noticed that they were mostly does and fawns, and he asked Owasin about this. "The does and fawns go first," Owasin exclaimed. "They seem to get restless for the forests early, but the bucks are different. When the mating season comes along in October, they won't have time to eat or rest for a whole month. So now they're up north putting on fat to carry them through the fall. They won't start south for another couple of weeks." Jamie interrupted. "Look down there," he shouted. In a sheltered hollow by a riverbank below them was an unmistakable debris of a campsite. Wild with excitement, the boys scrambled down to what had been Denicazi's first camp on the river during his journey north. The boys found many signs to indicate the camp was very old, not very old, but what really filled them with joy was the discovery of a little catch containing some dry fish, some tea, and a little bag of flour. Obviously, this food had been intended for their homeward journey, and the fact that it was still untouched seemed to prove that Denicazi was still somewhere to the north. Actually, Denicazi and his men had slipped past his cache the previous night in their panic-stricken flight. With their heavy load of meat, they had no real need to pick up the cache. At this moment, the Italian men were already beginning the long chain of portages back to the Itanthua Lake. Much relieved and quite certain that they would be picked up in a day or so, the boys returned to their camp and spent the rest of the day waiting, resting, and gorging on caribou meat. They relaxed for the first time since the awful moment on the rapids near the stone house. Jamie's leg benefited from the rest, and he found that he could again put his weight on it without pain. At noon, the next day, the boys decided to go north and meet their rescuers along the shore. The weather remained fair, and they enjoyed the walk. Many birds were moving south. A flock of Canada geese rose from the tundra pond and beat heavily into the clear sky, calling their haunting notes. Flocks of longspurs, little sparrow-like birds, rose in front of the boys like clouds of dust. Curlews and golden plover whistled and called from the riverbanks. Hundreds of family parties of ptarmigan cackled from the willow swales along the route. There was food in plenty, but the boys wasted no ammunition, for they still had enough deer meat to last a few days longer. By evening, when they found no further signs of the Indians, they began to feel distinctly uneasy. That night, they slept fitfully. In the morning, Jamie put their doubts into words. "Do you think they might have gone home by a different route?" he asked suddenly. "No," Wasson replied stoutly. "They must be down river from us. We'll walk for another day. We should find their camp or see their canoes before nighttime." Impatience and worry made them hurry their pace. By late afternoon, they'd come in sight of a big lake. Knowing that the Ethan Adeli hunters would have chosen the west shore where the deer were, the boys crossed the river at this point. The water was swift but not too deep, and they managed to wade and jump across a shallow stretch. They'd hardly climbed the opposite bank when they smelled a pungent odor. "Something awful dead around here," Jamie said, wriggling his nose in disgust. A short search showed them what it was. Behind a knoll lay a dead caribou that had obviously been shot. The find cheered the boys up amazingly. Hurrying on, they made their way down the west shore of the lake in the last rays of the setting sun. Suddenly, Wasson spotted a flicker of light ahead. "Campfire!" he yelled. Immediately, Jamie lifted the rifle and fired half a dozen signal shots. The sounds echoed off the hills on both sides of the river, but the signal went unanswered. Only a growing silence followed the dying away of the fusillade. Worse still, the distant flicker of light winked out and vanished. The boys looked at each other in stunned silence. "Maybe we scared them," Jamie said hopefully. "After all, they don't know we're here. Maybe they think it was Eskimo shooting and put out their fire on purpose." Both boys grasped at this explanation. There was no use trying to go farther that night, and if Jamie's idea was correct, it might even be dangerous to blunder into the Ethan Adeli party in darkness. So not bothering to light a fire, the boys made camp and slept restlessly under their blankets. When Jamie awoke, Owassen was standing on a rock, straining his eyes toward the north for signs of smoke from the Indians' breakfast fires. There was no smoke. As far as the eye could see, the long files of caribou moved unperturbedly down the valley. They saw all this with something near panic in their hearts, for they both knew that if there had been hunters to the north, the deer would have been disturbed. "Come on," Jamie said. "Never mind breakfast. Let's get going quick. It was Denikazi's fire we saw last night. We should reach his camp by noon. And if it wasn't, well," he did not finish the sentence. Already the terrible thought that they had somehow missed the Indians had become a certainty in the boys' hearts. They pushed forward at top speed. Shortly before noon, as they came opposite a cliff on the western hills, a sudden flash of light caught their eyes. They could be no doubt of what it was. Up on a cliff, a sheet of quartz or mica was catching the sun's rays and reflecting them like a bright mirror. With sinking hearts, the boys understood that this must have been the fire of the evening before. Fear mounted steadily in their hearts, but they pushed forward grimly, and in early afternoon they came to the last of the deer fence. A gap was close to the lake shore, and the camp where the Chippewyans had made their kill was near at hand. It did not take the boys long to discover it or to read the ominous message it held for them. The remains of many caribou told the story of a successful hunt some days before. With sinking hearts, they searched for some signs that the Indians might have gone further north. There was no such sign. Instead, there was clear evidence that the Ethan Adeli had stayed at this place only long enough to kill and repair many deer, enough to fill their canoes to overloading. Remembering the urgent need for meat at the home camps, the boys could hope no longer. They knew now beyond a doubt that the hunters had gone home. Jamie's voice trembled when he spoke. "How could we have missed them, Owassen?" he cried. "How could we have?" Owassen had no answer. He too was crushed by the knowledge that the rescue, which had seemed so certain, had now vanished utterly. He knew there was no hope that Denikazi would return, even after he heard the boys were missing. If he searched for them at all, it would be along the Kazan. They had made a gamble. Now they knew they had lost. In order to avoid thinking about their desperate plight, Owasin busied himself lighting a fire from heaps of willows left behind by the Chippewyans. Methodically, he placed pieces of meat to cook before the flames. With the fatalism of his ancestors, he refused to think about the mistakes which passed. It was different for Jamie. The future was close to him and terrifying. He knew that the nearest friends were 300 miles away by canoe, and they had no canoe. Summer was coming to an end, and long before they could walk even a small part of the way home, winter would fall upon them and they would perish. Jamie thought about his uncle, about McNair Lake, and finally his restless thoughts came back to the great stone house, the cause of all the trouble. It was my fault, he thought. I got Owasin into this. From his pocket, he drew out the thin sheet of lead he'd taken from the old Norse tomb. He was about to throw it away when something made him pause. His mood of depression seemed to lighten. Courage began to flow back into his heart, and he was thinking, those old Vikings, they sailed thousands of miles across oceans in boats. We wouldn't dare to use even on Reindeer Lake. And they explored right into the Barren Lands 1,000 or more years ago. Something hardly any white man has done since. They weren't afraid of anything at all. Slowly, he put the lead plate back into his pocket and stood up. He began to speak, and though his voice trembled a little, he was in control of himself. Jamie McNair was almost a man. We'd better face it, Owasin, he said. There isn't a chance for us to get out of here alive before the winter comes. But if the Eskimos can live here all winter long, so can we. Owasin smiled. Getting to his feet, he shook himself as if to clear away the grim forebodings that had lain over him. That's Cree talk, Jamie, he said. Good talk. You are right. If we can get food and clothes and shelter, we will be all right. We can get all those things if we really try. Then, in the winter, we can make a sled, load it with meat for the journey, and head home cross country. Owasin's dark eyes glittered at the prospect of the arrival back at the Cree camps. He could see it in his mind. They would not be boys any longer, but hardened adventurers, with such a tale to tell that even the old men of the tribe would listen with awe. Jamie caught the enthusiasm in Owasin's voice. He began to feel the challenge of adventure. We'll trap white foxes, he said excitedly. Then we get back, we'll be rich as well as famous. Ignoring the difficulties they would have to face, they squatted by the fire and talked. Plans were made, discarded, and made again. They talked until they were exhausted. Then the excitement drained away, and the immense and lonely Arctic plains closed in upon them once more. All the cheerful talk seemed to only be dream stuff. The fire flared up brightly, and in a sudden spurt of light, Owasin and Jamie looked at each other with intent eyes. Suddenly, Jamie jumped to his feet. All right, he said loudly. We've made our brag. Now, let's live up to it.